The woman they called a fraud was standing on Main Street when Martha started talking. It was a Tuesday, which meant the feed store was open and most of the town was out. Martha had a voice built for distance, and she used it. She said Molly had sold her a tin of something that did nothing for her nephew's cough, and she wanted the town to know it. She said a woman who traveled alone with a bag of remedies was not a healer. She said there was a word for what Molly was, and the word was not a kind one. People laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Molly stood with her satchel at her side and did not move. She had a stillness about her that some people read as guilt, and others might have read as patience, if they'd been paying a different kind of attention. She was 25 years old, and she had been standing in streets like this one before. She knew how to wait. Frank was leaning against the post outside the feed store. He watched. He was not a man who spoke into other people's business without cause, and he had not yet found his cause. He had a way of going very still himself, and the two of them, the woman in the street and the man at the post, were the stillest things in town that morning. Then someone shouted from the direction of the mill. A boy was being carried by two men, his hand wrapped in a feed sack already dark with blood. The men were shouting for the doctor. Someone told them Dr. Henry was 3 weeks out on his circuit and not expected back before the first snow. The boy's name was Charlie. He was 14 and he worked the mill on account of his father's bad back. The blade had found 3 of his fingers and torn rather than cut, and the men carrying him looked more frightened than Charlie did, because Charlie had gone somewhere quiet inside himself the way people do when the pain gets large enough. Frank stepped off the porch. He looked at the boy, and then he looked at Molly and said, "Can you stitch a wound?" It was not quite a question. Molly was already opening her satchel. They laid Charlie on the table inside the feed store because it was closest and it was wide. Molly called for clean water and a lamp brought near, and someone to hold the boy's arm steady. Frank took the arm. He did not look away, and he did not speak. And when Charlie made a sound, Frank put his other hand on the boy's shoulder and kept it there. The town that had been laughing 10 minutes ago was now standing at the door and the window. Molly worked the way water moves, no wasted motion. Her hands were not delicate hands. They were hands that had done this before, and the people watching could see the difference between someone who had learned a thing and someone who had lived inside it and carried it in their bones. She cleaned the wound and examined what could be saved, and did not explain herself to the room. Frank watched her hands without meaning to, the sureness of them, the way they moved without hesitation through something that would have made most people step back. She was young, was the thing that kept occurring to him. Young and certain in a way that had nothing to do with youth. She stitched Charlie's hand. She saved what could be saved, 2 whole fingers, and enough of the third that he would use it again in time. When she finished, she wrapped the hand with a firmness that was also a kind of gentleness, the way you close a book you mean to return to. Charlie came back to himself slowly. He looked at his hand. He looked at Molly. "You'll keep it." His eyes went wet, but he did not cry, because he was 14 and the whole town was watching. Frank sent the other men out. He paid for the cloth she'd used, without being asked. Molly repacked her satchel with the same order she always used. Each thing returned to its place. Frank watched that too. The order of it, the way nothing was careless. Outside, the street had gone quiet in a different way than before. The boarding house had no rooms left. The freight wagons had been delayed 3 days up the road, and the men were waiting them out. Frank told her this without apology, more a statement of the situation as it stood. The ranch had a back room off the kitchen with a cot and a stove, and she was welcome to it until Dr. Henry came through. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided is right and sees no need to ornament. Molly looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her satchel. The ranch was 2 miles out. They rode because Frank had his horse at the rail, and he brought it around without discussion, and she put her foot in the stirrup and settled behind him with her satchel across her lap, and neither of them made anything of it. The cold came down off the ridge, and the road was frozen hard, and the light was going fast, pulling the color out of the fields before you were ready for it to leave. The back room was small and smelled of wood and old flour. There was a cot, a stove, a window that looked out at the fence line, and beyond it the open brown of the winter pasture. The room had its own outside door, which gave the town less to say than it wanted. Molly set her satchel on the floor beside the cot, with the care of someone setting down something they would need to find again in the dark. Frank built the fire without asking. She watched him do it, and then she unpacked what she needed for the morning, and he left her to it. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. By the next day people knew where Molly was staying, and by the day after that some of them had found reasons to come out to the ranch. An old man came with a chest that rattled when he breathed. Molly listened with her ear against his back, and her eyes closed, still and attentive as someone reading something important in a language they have spent years learning. She gave him something for the congestion, and showed him how to sit when he slept so it would not settle. He left walking a little straighter than he had arrived. Fevers came, and winter coughs came, and frightened mothers came, and Molly handled each the same way she handled everything, without making more of it than it was. People came and went, and they all wanted the same thing from her, what she knew, what she carried, what she could do, and they left with it, and she returned to her work. Nobody asked where she had come from. She was useful, which meant she was welcome, and she had come to understand that those two things were not the same as being known. Frank observed all of it without commentary, the way she moved through the kitchen in the early morning, the low register she used with frightened people, steady and even, offering calm the way you offer a handhold, the way every instrument went back to its exact place in the satchel without her having to look. He did not remark on any of it, but he noticed. By the end of the second week, the house had found its rhythms without anyone arranging them. He was up before light, and she rose not long after, and by the time he came in from the morning's first work, she had coffee on and whatever the larder allowed. One morning, she was at the window with her cup when he came in, looking out at the frost on the fence posts. He poured his coffee and sat, and they ate without ceremony. After a while he said, "You sleep all right?" She considered it honestly. "Better than I have in a while." He nodded at his plate and did not pursue it, but something in the answer had registered, and she could see that it had. On a Thursday evening he came in late, and supper was already on the table, and she was sitting with her notes spread in front of her, reading while she waited. He washed up and sat down. "You didn't have to hold it." "It keeps fine," she said, not looking up. He served himself and ate, and she set her notes aside and ate too. And the fire worked in the grate, and outside the wind had come up off the open country and was making itself known against the eaves. After a while he said the fence on the north side would need a full day before the hard freeze. She asked how long they had. He said maybe a week. She told him the old man's chest had been clearer that morning, that she thought he would get through the winter all right. Frank looked at her across the table. She looked back. Two people in a warm kitchen with the wind outside and supper between them, and nothing in particular being said, and it had the feel of something that had been going on long before it started. He looked back down at his plate. She picked up her notes. The evening went on. It was one of those evenings just before full dark, the sky going deep blue above the ridge and the cold settling in properly, when Frank came around the side of the house and found her already on the bench along the front wall, her hands in her lap and nothing in them, watching the last light leave the pasture. He sat beside her. He had his coffee, and she had hers, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Where'd you learn it?" "The healing." She looked at the pasture. "A woman named Ruth, over in Carver County. She took me on when I was 14. He waited. "I grew up in the orphanage there," she said. "Ruth used to come by when the children were sick. I followed her around until she let me help, and then until she let me do more than help. She died when I was 22 and left me her bag and her books. It was enough to start with. The last color was leaving the sky. A horse shifted in the pen and blew out a long breath that hung in the cold air. After that I just kept moving," she said. "Town to town. People need what I know, and I go where they need it." She said it plainly, without asking for anything in return. But there was something underneath the plainness that said she had never been asked to explain it before, to anyone, and did not quite know what it felt like to be asked. Frank turned his cup in his hands. "Must get lonesome," he said. "Town to town." She considered it honestly. "You stop noticing after a while," she said. "Or you think you do." He looked at her then. Not quickly, not sideways. Directly and without apology. The way a man looks at something he's been trying to understand and has finally decided to look it straight. She held it without looking away. After a moment he looked back at the ridge. He stood and picked up both cups. "Cold's coming in," he said. She rose beside him, and they went inside, and the door closed, and the night settled over the ranch. It was the third week when someone brought the rumor to town. A woman had died, they said, in another town, under Molly's care. People said she had done something wrong, and a family had buried their mother because of it. Martha heard it first and made sure others heard it second. The women who had brought their children out grew uncertain. The old man stopped coming by. The warmth that had been slowly building pulled back like water before a frost. Molly did not defend herself. The habit of silence was deep, and she went on with her work. Frank heard it on a Friday in the feed store from two men who did not know he was behind them. He came home and split wood for a long while in the cold, and then came inside. She was at the table with her notes. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window, and the quiet held for a while before he said, "There's talk about a woman dying." Molly set her pen down. She looked at her hands flat on the table. "A mother," she said. "The baby was turned wrong and had been for too long before I arrived. I stayed the whole night. There was nothing to be done by the time I got there, and nothing to be done after. I stayed anyway." Frank looked at her. She did not look away from her hands. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee and went back to the window. She sat for a long time after he left the room, her hands still on the table. The lamp burned low beside her notes, and she did not reach for them. Word came through the postmaster near the end of the 5th week. Dr. Henry had taken a post east of the mountains and would not be returning to the circuit. People stood around that news for a day or two and then got practical, the way people do when the alternative is going without. Quietly, without anyone deciding it, They began bringing things to Molly. They would have waited to bring a doctor. A broken finger, set and wrapped. A wound gone hot that needed watching. An infant's cough the mother could not calm. When a night call came, Frank rode out with her. He did not announce this as a decision. The first time it happened, he simply had the horse ready when she came out with her satchel, and she looked at him and put her foot in the stirrup, and they went. He waited outside in the cold while she worked, and when she came out he was still there, and they rode back in the dark without discussion. It happened that way every time after. Martha kept her sideways looks until the night her nephew's cough turned sharp enough to frighten her. She came after dark and stood at the outside door like pride had brought her halfway, and fear had brought her the rest. Molly took the boy in, worked until his breathing eased, and sent him home before dawn. Martha did not apologize. She only stopped speaking against her, which in that town carried almost as far. It had been a hard week. A difficult birth had kept Molly 2 nights running, and she had come home both mornings gray with exhaustion. Frank had said nothing, only left things where she would find them. Coffee in the mornings, a plate kept back at night. On the Friday she came home before dark and sat in the chair nearest the fire and did not reach for anything. Frank came in from the stock and found her there. He sat in the other chair and worked a length of leather, and the fire did what fires do, and the house settled around them. After a while her eyes closed. He went on with the leather. When he added a log and settled back, she had drifted toward him, her head coming to rest against his shoulder with the slow ease of someone who has given up the last of their waking self. He went still. He set the leather on the arm of the chair. The fire worked. The wind pressed at the windows. He sat with her weight against his shoulder, and he knew what this was. He had known for some time. He woke deep in the night with the fire burned to coals, and her breath slow and even against his collar. He got up carefully, and built the fire back, and found the blanket, and settled it over her, and stood a moment looking at her face, which in sleep had let go of its watchfulness, and was simply a face, and it was a good one. He put his coat on and went out before the light came. She woke late with the fire warm and the blanket around her. She looked at the other chair, and the piece of leather on its arm and the fire that someone had tended, and she did not move for a long time. The last of the local herd came down from the high pasture on a Saturday, which meant the festival in the square that night, which was the custom. Lanterns strung between the posts, a fiddle, tables of food. The men in from the hills with the looseness of people who have finished a hard thing and are ready to set it down. Molly went because Frank was going. She wore her better dress and stood where the lamplight reached, but did not insist, at the edge of things the way she had always stood in town after town, present without being seen. Frank came and stood beside her. The fiddle slowed and the square reorganized itself, and he looked at her. "Dance with me." She looked at the square, at the people already watching from the corners of their eyes. She handed him her cup. He set both cups on the table and offered his hand, and she took it, and they walked out into the lamplight. He was not a graceful man, but he was steady, which in a partner is worth considerably more, and she found the rhythm of him quickly. His hand was at her waist, and her hand was in his, and he was looking at her, not at the crowd, not past her shoulder, at her with an expression that was plain and certain, and had been a long time arriving. The song ended. Neither of them stepped back. The fiddle started something livelier. Frank looked down at her. "Walk with me." They left the light and went to the quiet end of the street where the fiddle became something distant and the cold came off the ridge clean and sharp. Frank stopped and looked out at the dark, and she could see him arranging something, a careful man putting words in the right order because he intended to say a thing only once. "The town knows it now," he said. "They need what you do." A pause. "I need what you do, too. Not the medicine." He looked at her. "I mean, the rest of it." She stood very still. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Permanent. As my wife, if that's what you'd want. Not on account of practicality. I want that to be clear." It was clear. It had been clear in the coffee left without comment, and the fire built up before dawn, and the blanket laid over her by hands that tried not to wake her, and the horse waiting outside every house she had been called to in the cold. It had been clear on the porch in the fading light when he asked where she had learned what she knew, the first time she could remember that anyone had wanted to know something about her that was not written in the contents of her satchel. Her hand found his at his side. She put it there against his, warm in the cold air. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." He turned his hand and closed it around hers, and they stood in the cold while the fiddle played on without them, and neither of them was in any hurry to go back. They were married 3 weeks later on the church steps. The sky was pewter, and a pine bough had been fixed to the door because it was nearly Christmas, and that was the custom. The minister was brief because Frank had asked him to be. More people came than either of them had expected. Charlie was there with his hand lightly wrapped, but healing clean, and he held the door with his good arm and stood straight about it. Molly carried her satchel to the steps. At the threshold she set it down and went inside without it, and the people who saw said nothing, which was the right way to receive it. When it was done, they came out into the cold afternoon, and Frank's hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, just present, in the way of something that had decided where it belonged. They walked home in the early dark. The road was the same road. The cold was the same cold. Behind them the town settled into its evening, smoke from the chimneys, lamplight finding the windows one by one. Come spring, the satchel hung on a hook by the door of the small room on Main Street that Frank built out and fitted with a proper door. Martha passed it sometimes on her way to the dry goods and did not stop and did not look sideways any more, which was as close to an apology as the town was going to get from her. And it was enough. Molly worked and Frank worked, and the seasons moved through the pasture and the long road into town. And outside the window of that small room on quiet afternoons, you could sometimes hear the livery horses in the pen 2 streets over, and the sound carried clean in the cold air, and it was a good sound to work to. And that was the story of Molly and Frank. Let me know what you thought of this one. Thank you.